the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy. Lovely to see you, Lisa. I mean, you represent a Northwest constituency, sort of frankly born and bred in that neck of the woods. What's your sense of why this problem of the virus is so much greater in the north of England, as I say, especially at the moment in the northwest, than, say, for example, where we're sitting now in London?
Well, if you listen to local leaders, and one of the criticisms I would have of the government is that they haven't done that. All of those issues that Ruth raised, that she's dealing with the SNP in Scotland, we're also finding exactly the same problems from her party in government at Westminster. But if you listen to local leaders, they will tell you that the decision to come out of national lockdown was taken at the point at which London was at the right point on the curve. But it was disastrous for the north of England because it was precisely the wrong moment for the north. And this is a repeated pattern of many parts of the country being completely left out of decision-making. If the government had bothered to pick up the phone to many of those local leaders, not just local council leaders and metro mayors, but public health directors as well, they would have realised that this was a real problem. They would have realised far earlier that the communications was shambolic and that people were confused about the rules. And they would have realised far earlier that unless you provide people with financial support to help them self-isolate, many people in those parts of the country that have been battered by austerity, that are now working on 0 hours contracts in insecure employment, are frightened of going for a test because the financial implications for their family of having to self-isolate are enormous. But they didn't, and they still haven't talked to local leaders, and that's one of the reasons why we keep repeating these mistakes and why the situation isn't getting better.
So, look, we'll come on to the sort of financial, economic consequences of all of this and what needs to be done in a moment. But, you know, again, just put you to this point I've sort of been repeating, I'm afraid, a few times already this evening. There is a paradox that, the prevalence of the infection is lower in Scotland, and yet they have today announced much more severe restrictions on people's way of life. Surely you would want to see something similar in your neck of the woods in the northwest.
I mean, what I'd like to see is a locally driven approach so that our public health directors, our local councils who are responsible for public health and managing lockdowns... So
are you saying you don't want to see restaurants and bars and pubs closed?
Look, I want to see public health protected first and foremost. And if
that
is the most effective way of doing it, provided there's a financial support package in place, because as Ruth Davidson rightly said, this is, there are some businesses here who will not survive this unless we get financial support. And many areas that have been in lockdown for a long time, Leicester is entering 100 days, have been crying out for more financial support for businesses and to protect jobs. But protecting public health is absolutely the right way to go.
I mean, certainly protecting jobs, protecting businesses is vital. But if time is of the essence, and sometimes it takes a bit of time to work out the support package, surely, in a sense, you've got to do the public measures first, and at that point, put in the money to protect the jobs and the businesses.
But this is why we've been saying to the government since early summer that they had to have a plan, because we knew that this was coming. We knew that schools were going to go back in September. We knew that universities were going to go back, and part of the rise in infections in Scotland is to do with universities, as it is in Manchester. We knew that winter was coming, that people would start to pick up bugs, that there would be pressure on the testing system, that there would be this perfect storm of winter flu, of COVID, of schools returning and the NHS potentially becoming overwhelmed. And we've been saying to the government for months, you've got to get a plan and a strategy in place to deal with this.
Could I just ask one very quick question before we go to the break? We've got more to talk about after the break. We've got a government which has set its store on introducing, local, originally it said very local, that's not happening so much anymore, but regional restrictions rather than restrictions for the whole country. I fear that in a divided country, actually, if there's a big part of the country where you can't go to pub or restaurant, and then you look down south and everybody still is, do you think that'll breed resentment and more division?
That resentment is absolutely there already.
It's already there.
People are absolutely furious about the way that they've been treated. I spent part of this week on a Zoom call with local leaders. Steve Rotherham, the Mayor of Merseyside, said it's like a pick and mix. The government are just picking measures and flinging them at different areas of the country.
But the sort of north-south divide, which we've all been desperately trying to bridge for years, that's going to get wider, do you think?
I think it's there. I think there's a real level of fury. And actually, if you talk to some of the northern northern Tories, the Tories who recently won those red wall seats that Ruth was talking about, they are deeply worried about this, and they are right to be, because it is not understandable to people why some areas are seeing huge rises in infections but subject to less restrictions. In Oldham, for example, which is part of Greater Manchester, you're allowed fewer mourners at a funeral than you are in Wigan, Bolton and other parts of Greater Manchester. I mean, it's just not...
You're right, that sort of thing doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense at all.
But do you think, therefore, we're going to have to go back to national measures? Is that where you think we're going to have to go, out of a sense almost of fairness?
No, I think we need far more honesty from the government, and they need to start levelling with the public about why they're making the decisions that they're making. For example, in Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Newcastle, all those leaders are grappling with a real problem with the 10 p.m. curfew, because they are destination places where people travel to go out for drinks. And so they're seeing huge numbers of people spilling out onto the street late at night. There's a reason why that isn't working, particularly in those areas. So the government needs to work with those local leaders to get the right model for the right areas. Well,
I want to pick up on all of that with you in just a moment. Please don't go away. We've got lots more from Lisa Nandy, and we'll also be talking Trump. See you in a minute. Well, before we talk about whether Keir Starmer is cutting through with the voters you need to win if you're going to stand a chance in the next election, just on that issue we were talking about, the 10 p.m. curfew, in your view, was it a mistaken policy?
The honest truth is that we don't know why the government made the decision that they made. We've been asking for the scientific basis for that decision for quite a long time. The frustrations that Ruth Davidson was talking about with the SNP in Holyrood are absolutely the same frustrations.
But whether or not there's scientific evidence, you've got the evidence of your own eyes, people congregating outside pubs and getting drunk and, you know, doing precisely the opposite of what they're supposed to be doing. There's going to be a vote on this where we think it's sort of still a bit murky whether there's going to, if there's a vote on it, should Labour vote against that particular measure?
Well, look, we've tried to stay in step with the government on the official guidance, not least because, as Ruth Smith said earlier, because people are so confused about the rules that we don't want to add to the confusion. But today, when Keir challenged the Prime Minister to give him some reasoning behind this, and he was unable to do so, was a turning point. And this is us putting the government on notice. If they want our support for that measure in that critical vote next week, then they need to produce that evidence. They need to explain why they've made this decision and why they believe that they are right, that this is workable and effective, and why they believe that local leaders in those areas are wrong when they say that it's actually counterproductive.
I mean, it might turn out to be completely, well, not it might, it will turn out in many parts of the country to be completely irrelevant in just a few days, because in parts of the country, in fact, might even be, you know, very close to where your constituency is, pubs and restaurants are just going to be told they can't open. This tiering system, some local leaders are very anxious about it because they think that sort of just 3 sets of rules for how you behave doesn't take enough account of local conditions. What do you feel about the government's move to this tiering system? I
think any attempt to bring some kind of consistency to the process would be really welcome.
Is a good thing in your view?
Is a really good thing, and some simplicity too. But if they don't do this in conjunction with local leaders, it is not going to work. These are the people managing and enforcing the rules in their local areas.
But, I mean, in conjunction, it is important, but one of the things I get when I talk to local leaders is none of them want to be in the worst tier. In the end, the government has to make a quite difficult decision about where you set the threshold.
I'm not sure that's right, actually. I mean, in Greater Manchester, where I'm an MP, we had a situation where across Greater Manchester, all the local leaders were saying, we've got to stick together because otherwise it will become far too confusing. And then you had a government that listened to the Tory MP in Trafford and took Trafford out of lockdown measures against the advice of the local council who wanted them to remain. And we've seen the result across Greater Manchester.
Now, sadly, we're almost out of time. A couple of quick ones, if we can. One is, why do you think Keir Starmer doesn't yet appear to be cutting through with voters in those once safe Labour seats that turned Tory at the last election?
Well, we've got a huge mountain to climb, and we've got a particularly huge mountain to climb with those voters. I represent a number of those people. I hung on at the last election, but, you know, many of my colleagues didn't, and we lost a lot of trust, and there were a huge number of reasons for that, but none of us in the Labour Party are complacent about it. We're under no illusions, and that's why Keir has been getting out to those parts of the country with his regular call Keir sessions and listening to people's concerns, meeting them, you know, where they are on their territory, and not just showing that he's listening, but actually that he's prepared to act on those concerns as well.
And finally, is Liam McCluskey punishing Keir Starmer by reducing the amount that Unite will fund the party for a while?
Well, I listened to Len's interview on Newsnight and I didn't agree with it at all. I mean, it's a question for Unite what funding they choose to give to the Labour Party. But I guess I would just gently say to Len that it's a question for Labour about the decisions that we take and how we choose to behave, particularly during a global pandemic. We're focused on helping to make sure that this country gets through that, and that, you know, what happens at Unite is a question for Unite.
And broadly, though, you would say to his members he's doing the wrong thing?
Well, I listened to what he said in the interview. He said that he thought that Labour was wrong to pay off the whistleblowers who bravely spoke out against anti-Semitism under the last Labour leadership. I completely disagree with him about that. Keir disagrees with him about that. And actually, Becky Long-Bailey, all three of us in that contest said very, very clearly that we would pay those whistleblowers off if we won that contest. It's the right thing to do. And so I disagree with Len completely about that.
Lisa, great to see you as always.